My name's Josh Rovner. I'm the Senior Advocacy Associate at the Sentencing Project. The Sentencing Project is a leader in changing the way Americans think about crime and punishment. We're joined today by Brittany LaMarr from the Connecticut Justice Alliance, Florentina Cruz with Families and Friends of Louisiana's Incarcerated Children, and Nate Balis from the Annie E. Casey Foundation. I'll let them introduce themselves in just a couple minutes. The Sentencing Project advocates for effective and humane responses to crime that minimize imprisonment and criminalization of youth and adults by promoting racial, ethnic, economic, and gender justice. That mission is at the heart of the report we're discussing today, Too Many Locked Doors. I'm often interested in youth justice data, even though I realize that numbers cannot tell a full story, which is why today's webinar merges data from our new report with advocacy strategies that you, our listeners, will be able to put to work where you live. We'll have time for your questions at the end of the presentations, so please use the Q&A box at any time, and we'll get to them at the end. After my presentation, Florentina and Brittany will talk about their experiences with youth justice systems in Louisiana and Connecticut, the impact on families and communities, and the challenges to reform. Then Nate will share some even more recent data than what's in my report about population shifts in juvenile justice facilities. My report's really about the front door, and Nate's is really about the back door of releases. I'm going to start here, because when we talk about the scope of youth incarceration, we first need to acknowledge that it's a harmful option, even if some would argue that it's occasionally required. There's many detrimental outcomes from detention and commitment. They lead to poor health outcomes. Educational achievement suffers. Confined youth are more likely to reoffend when they go home. This is not what we're looking for our kids, for our families, for our communities, and it's even true for very, very short stays in these facilities. Despite this knowledge that any amount of confinement is harmful for most of our kids, many of us often use a one-day count, but that's really not what we're looking for. The true footprint isn't about a single day. It's about how many kids get arrested each year, get referred to court, detained, you name it. So we do have an alternative. We can look at the number of kids in placement over the course of a year and see how those numbers change over time. Now, the best data set for that information is missing a lot of kids too. So the numbers I'm about to share are an undercount. Still, it's the best place to start. Talk about the scope of youth incarceration, we need to think in terms of how many kids the system touches. Unfortunately, one of the more accessible numbers, one that I often use, is a one-day count that shows how many kids are locked up on a typical day. That graph on screen shows what I'm talking about. I compared the one-day count to the annual count. The one-day count is shown in blue on the left, and the annual count is in black on the right. On the fourth Wednesday in October 2019, there were about 36,500 people held in juvenile facilities. On the other hand, over the course of that same year, children and teenagers sent to juvenile court on a delinquency offense were detained or committed more than 200,000 times. In other words, the one-day count represents less than 1/6 of uses of youth placement, and that's a huge gap. Now, let me first say, of course, these are very different numbers from each other. Of course, the annual count is higher. A youth who's detained on May 1st and released on June 1st is not going to show up on a one-day count taken in October, and the one-day count doesn't claim otherwise. This report talks about how much higher that gap is, and it's 6 times higher. We see much higher discrepancies at detention than commitment, meaning the moment of arrest as opposed to the punishment after there's been a court hearing. For every 1 detained youth in the one-day count, 13 are detained in the course of a year. There's a lot of cycling in and out of juvenile detention centers, and the length of stay explains it. As I said a minute ago, a teenager detained on May 1st who goes home on June 1st won't show up in a one-day count taken in October. And we can make some decent guesses about the length of stay based on this ratio. It's about 2, 3, or 4 weeks based on the category of offense. Now, let me tell you a story about some kids in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. This is a story reported by ProPublica. couple of kindergartners tried their best to pick a fight with an older kid. And when I say older, we're talking about a fifth grader. So the size differences were pretty enormous, but we're still talking about young children here. Someone recorded all of this, posted it online, and the police got involved from there. The police, though, couldn't figure out who the kindergartners were. They couldn't figure out who the fifth graders were. But they could figure out about 11 kids who were there and watched it all happen. And those 11 kids, all of them Black, and all of them in elementary school, were brought to Rutherford County's juvenile detention centers. Some of them were in handcuffs. On the left, you can see a photo from their elementary school. On the right, an image from their detention center. Those 11 kids were run through an undefined filter system that determined some of them needed to be locked up. See, in Rutherford County, about half the kids who are arrested are detained. And according to Rutherford County Judge Donna Scott Davenport, we should all know her name, who approved the detentions, quote, "Being detained in our facility is not a picnic at all. It's not supposed to be. It's a consequence for inaction." Let me step back and note that watching a fight and not breaking it up is not even a crime in Tennessee. Shown on screen are total referrals to juvenile courts nationwide over the decade. And those year-by-year referrals, basically arrests, are divided into two blocks on the charts. In blue, at the bottom, that's the number of kids detained upon their referral. In purple, those are the kids who are referred and not detained. Next, we can complete a pretty simple math problem. We can take the number of detentions and divide it by the number of referrals, and that's the math on screen. In 2019, it was 26%, basically 1 in 4. We can do this math again and again. In 2010, it was 24%, still basically 1 out of 4, but a little less often than 2010 than in 2019. And let me say clearly that an increase from 24% of the time to 26% of the time is not a large increase from any angle. But what I will say is that these numbers are moving in the wrong direction. We've had 16 years since the famous report, Dangers of Detention, was published, and only more research since then to confirm what we already know. Despite that, when push comes to shove, kids who are referred to court today are more likely than at the start of the decade to be detained. Giving the discretion to police or judges does not seem to be the solution. Ending the detention of thousands of young people, often held for a handful of days, requires intervention by state legislatures to limit detention only to circumstances where public safety is at risk. After decades of investment in detention alternatives from localities nationwide, these numbers continue to move in the wrong direction, and that's why we believe that the system won't right itself without legislative interventions. Diving a little further into the report, I think that the real value here is that I performed that pretty simple math program just a zillion times and compared the results. You can take a look at the number of detentions, divide by the number of referrals, and get a quotient that shows the likelihood of detention. And there's so many ways this number can be split up, whether by race, by gender, by offense, and categories can be compared over time. So we can see whether Black youth referred to court were more likely to be detained in 2010 or 2019, and how that compares to their white peers. We can look at specific offenses and the likelihoods of detention by race and ethnicity. And what I can tell you, having created some bonkers spreadsheets to create this report, is that everywhere I looked, I saw disparities at the start of the decade only got worse. In general, the data reveal that white youth are about as likely and occasionally less likely to be detained as they were at the start of the decade, but their peers who are youth of color are more likely to be detained. A bad system got worse. Let me focus just on 2019, which is what you see on screen, and the likelihood of detention for all offenses by race and ethnicity. Moving from left to right on your screen. For white youth, they were detained about 20% of the time, which is a rather high ratio when you think about the level of offending that kids get arrested for. Latino youth were detained 32% of the time. Black youth detained 29% of the time. Asian youth, 26% of the time, and tribal youth, 25% of the time. Now, when I looked at categories of offending, I've consistently found youth of color treated more harshly than their white peers. This is for all offenses. When we talk about disparities, it's what you see here. Now, I'd like to compare that frustrating story to a better one. To this point, I've been talking about detention. That's when a child is held before any court hearing to determine guilt or innocence has taken place. There was an arrest and someone, generally a judge, decided the arrested child shouldn't go home. The likelihood of that an arrested child was detained went up slightly over the decade. On the other hand, we can look at the end of the process, when that same court-involved child is given some sort of consequence or punishment. Often charges are dropped or cases can be diverted away from the courts entirely. But the courts have a range of punishments to offer, including probation or what's called commitment in the juvenile system, and that's the equivalent of imprisonment in the adult system. The good news is that the likelihood of commitment for youth referred actually dipped a bit over the course of a decade. It's pretty remarkable to see how often a child was detained at the moment of arrest and then, having gone through a court process, having told their side of the story, hopefully having access to counsel, and having some distance from the events that got them arrested in the first place, they're not confined. Out of all the times that a kid was detained at the beginning, only about a sixth are committed at the end. The numbers speak for themselves. We are detaining too many kids, and the numbers show it. It suggests, and suggests is a pretty weaselly word, a pretty weaselly way to put this, but it suggests that detention is being used as a form of punishment and not used because the teenager is a threat to their community. I already mentioned how often it's only for a couple of weeks. And moreover, we can look back at the 55,000 times that youth were committed after their court hearing and see that about 40% of the time they weren't detained at the beginning of the process. The decision to detain is broken. The good news is that we can fix some of this process. Now, this is where I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues and friends. I will start with Florentina Cruz from Families and Friends of Louisiana's Incarcerated Children. If you'll just give me a moment, I will put her slides up on screen and allow her to introduce herself. Thank you. Share screen. Share. Okay, Florentina, are you ready?
Yes, that's actually the last slide though. So you might wanna...
Okay, I gave away the ending, didn't I? Okay, there we go.
All right, thank you. So just to introduce myself again, my name is Florentina Staigers Cruz, and I am the Communications Director with Families and Friends of Louisiana's Incarcerated Children. I'm actually here in the stead of Gina Womack, who's our co-founder, one of the co-founders and executive directors. And so as a communications director, I do have policy background. I really just want to focus kind of on the story of FLIC and how this report relates to that story. So if you can go to the next slide, Josh. So as you can see from these news articles, I'll just say that these news articles are from around the time that FLIC was established in 2001. And so as you can see, in the context of a lot of violence and abuse in Louisiana, a number of Black mothers, parents came together to support each other. And so you can see some of those parents there in the right-hand upper corner. You can also see some of the taglines of these newspapers, sort of giving you an idea of the context in which FLIC began. And that was the brutality, the abuse, the violence, and in particular in a prison called Tallulah. And also you can see I included this super predators arrive, and should we cage the new breed of vicious kids? So some of that language might seem familiar as we're also hearing many of these, this sort of a resurgence of the super predator myth. And so as our Black mothers and parents came together to support each other, they were able to fight for the closure of Tallulah and the passage of Act 1225. And Act 1225 was really intended to be a complete transformation of the youth justice system in Louisiana and implement a holistic model of care and a coordinated system of care. Unfortunately, it still remains an unfulfilled promise. There really wasn't enough resourcing or commitment to the legislation and to the act that passed. And so for the last 20 years, FLIC's work has really been trying to get the pieces of that legislation back together and to get it implemented. So if you can move on to the next slide, you can see that in 2001, when we began as an organization, we did see 2,457 youth incarcerated. So fast forward, you do see that that has significantly dropped to 738, but it also really doesn't tell the full picture. And I feel like that's sort of what we're here for today, is to really try to complete this narrative of what youth incarceration is looking like. So if you could go to the next slide, Josh. So in the context of FLIC forming, I think it's important to know, and what we've been working on in sort of the context of youth incarceration and even that decline, Louisiana is still one of the the incarceration capitals of the world in total. So youth and adults combined. So this is incarceration. And so also then that's one of the things that we're known for and first for, but we're also last in education and one of the last in the well-being of children. So it really points a picture points to the picture of what our policymakers are investing in. And so if you can go to the next slide. So we also recognize that many of the things that I showed you on that first slide in terms of news is still happening today. And we're kind of at a breaking point in the same way that we were at a breaking point in 2001. There's a lot of increased fears about youth crime, again, leading to that reinvigoration of the super predator myth. And the Office of Juvenile Justice in our system in general seems to be kind of at a breaking point. We see a lot of news about escalating abuse, violence, and escapes. A lot of the conditions of isolation and abuse have been aggravated by COVID that were there previously before COVID. And so we recently had, in March, there was an investigative report that broke nationally, and it was a collaboration between NBC, the Marshall Project, and ProPublica. And basically they highlighted the horrific conditions happening in what basically amounted to a secret prison. This prison was opened without anybody knowing that it would be opened, without any sort of, it wasn't even on the website. And there in that prison, it was really meant to contain what the deputy of the Office of Juvenile Justice said was the worst of the worst kids. And what happened in that facility and what continues to happen is the overuse of solitary confinement, where these kids are locked in for 23, 24 hours a day. There's use of pepper spray, lack of education or any mental health supports. So again, we're sort of at this breaking point once again. And so if you could go to the next slide. So why this report really matters to us in Louisiana is that it really is beginning to complete the picture of what incarceration actually looks like. And we've had a sense from hearing from families and in our community and people who are impacted that incarceration is much larger than what the numbers are telling us. And so this feels really validating to see this report. And I think it also really helps us understand the real impact on a community. And some of that impact that we see is definitely fears of police, fears of incarceration, and basically the aggravation of intergenerational trauma in our communities. If you can go to, yes, thank you, you're already there. Take, for example, this recent, sorry, back, you were there. A recent example of a 10-year-old boy. He was put in a chokehold by police. He was interrogated. He was put in detention, and then later the charges were dismissed. And so when we look at sort of community trauma and this legacy of racism in our country and in our communities, and this report really helps us understand that narrative of that impact of trauma. I don't actually know how long that 10-year-old boy stayed in detention, but any amount of time in my eyes is unacceptable. I also just want to mention that in New Orleans in particular, our youth are called Katrina babies right now, because this is a recognition of the trauma they endured as infants. So Katrina was 17 years ago, and now in a pandemic. However, moving to the next slide, those same Katrina babies are also doing great things. We have a youth-led No More Prisons campaign. And so this is a campaign led by our youth in our community to end youth incarceration. And so they brought together a coalition of organizations to move forward with this No More Prisons campaign. And also they engaged a legislator, Representative Royce Duplessis, to help with that. And Representative Royce Duplessis is actually the chair of the Juvenile Justice Reform Act Implementation Commission. And if you remember me mentioning Act 1225 in the beginning of the slide presentation, Act 1225 created a body that was supposed to be responsible for the implementation of that complete transformation of the justice system, and that was the JJRIC. However, the JJRIC quit meeting and was largely ineffective for many years. And so one of the pluses of sort of this moment that we're in is that we've seen the revival of interest in the JJRIC, and we were able to pass some legislation and get it reinvigorated and restarted. And actually the vice chair is what that was appointed is Gina. And so that's actually a standing position. It's just our director of FLIC is now permanently in that position to push that reform forward. As a result of that article regarding the use of pepper spray and solitary confinement in St. Martinville, which was the secret prison, we're also seeing some legislative movement towards a ban on solitary confinement. So that is hopeful, and that's in the legislature right now. So if you can move to the next slide. So the other thing that we want to just highlight in terms of this report is sort of our favorite recommendation, and that's really the recommendation to invest in community-based solutions. Not only do we know that incarceration is not only harmful and traumatizing to young people, it really doesn't make our communities any safer. And I think that there are some great statistics in the report that point to that truth. And so FLIC is really focused on our 3-point platform to address the mental health of our youth and families, to support their education, making sure that there's no zero tolerance policies and that the curriculum is culturally competent, and also to address poverty. Again, Louisiana ranks 49th in economic well-being of children. And so it's really important to look at the front end solutions of this problem instead of the deep end, investing in the deep end as Louisiana has been doing, because obviously, again, it's not working for us if we're investing so much in these carceral systems and continue to be #1 in incarceration. So that's all I have, and I'm going to pass it to Brittany. Yeah, and that's the last slide, which is some of our contact information. We can also put that in the chat box. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And so Brittany, you were interested in starting with the video. Should I load that up first?
Yeah, so we'll start there. I'll introduce myself, and then I'll point to you to start the video, if that works.
Perfect.
All right, so I'm
Brittany
LaMarr. I'm a justice advisor with CT Justice Alliance, which is a youth adult partnership working to end the criminalization of youth. The Alliance creates space and opportunity for youth to lead the conversation in youth justice reform and provide input and direction from young people's lived experiences. As an aside, I'm also a Master of Public Policy student at UConn and an incoming 1L student at UConn Law. However, my purpose here today is to provide my lived experience with the criminal legal system as a youth and an adult to offer insight into the many ways our system can better support our youth early on. So I want to start by playing a brief video that I think will help paint the picture of what I'm going to discuss following. You can go ahead.
Thank you so much.
Hey, line up! Line up! Everybody line up! We're about to race! Everybody line up. Shoulder to shoulder. Take off your backpacks. Basketball, line up. We're about to race. Hey, we are racing for a $100 bill. The winner of this race will take this. It's a $100 bill. Before I say go, I'm going to make a couple statements. If those statements apply to you, I want you to take 2 steps forward. If those statements don't apply to you, I want you to stay right where you're at. Take 2 steps forward if both of your parents are still married. Take 2 steps forward if you grew up with a father figure in the home. Take 2 steps forward if you had access to a private education. Take 2 steps forward if you had access to a free tutor growing up. Take 2 steps forward if you've never had to worry about your cell phone being shut off. Take 2 steps forward if you've never had to help mom or dad with the bills. Take 2 steps forward if it wasn't because of your athletic ability, you don't have to pay for college. Take 2 steps forward if you never wondered where your next meal was going to come from. I want you guys up here in the front just to turn around and look. Every statement I've made has nothing to do with anything any of you have done. Has nothing to do with decisions you've made. Everything I have said has nothing to do with what you've done. We all know these people up here have a better opportunity to win this $100. Does that mean these people back here can't race? No. We would be foolish to not realize we've been given more opportunity. We don't want to recognize that we've been given a head start. But the reality is we have. Now, there's no excuse. They still got to run their race. You still got to run your race. But whoever wins this $100, I think it'd be extremely foolish of you not to utilize that and learn more about somebody else's story. Because the reality is, if this was a fair race and everybody was back on that line, I guarantee you some of these black dudes would smoke all of you. And it's only because you have this big of a head start that you're possibly going to win this race called life. That is a picture of life, ladies and gentlemen. Nothing you've done has put you in the lead that you're in right now. When I say go, on your mark, get set, go! If you didn't learn anything from this activity, you're a fool.
Thank you, Josh. All right, so following that, I'll just provide a more, I mean, it's hard to follow that, but that kind of, paints the picture of what we need to be looking at when we're looking at young people and young people as a whole, especially when we're creating policies, that will alter the future and direction of young people in their lives. So a little bit more about myself. My first contact with the criminal legal system was in my teens. I was an all-state soccer player that ended my senior year of high school with the superlative least likely to be in class. I had a tumultuous home life, a father that was in and out of jail as long as I can remember, and juggled many emotional issues as a result. I found relief in drugs and alcohol as I struggled to stay afloat in school and engage in any sort of healthy social relationships. My first few arrests were as a teenager for multiple DUIs and possession charges. However, the only resource I was mandated to complete as a young person were alcohol education courses, where I learned about the dangers of driving while intoxicated. But what was never addressed were the deeper root issues behind me being a young teenager with multiple DUIs. So without ever having addressed the complex emotional root issues I dealt with, it wasn't long before those issues just exasperated and blew up. And it was only a couple of years before I then found myself homeless, dealing to support an opioid addiction. And by the time I was arrested again, I was 23 with 6 theft-related felonies and a handful of misdemeanors, which I served 4.5 years for in Connecticut's only female adult prison. I have to say that the resources that led to my recovery and my ability to complete my bachelor's as an honor student in 3 years, buy a home, become a fellow at Yale Law School, and get accepted into a master's degree program, and get accepted into UConn Law did not come from prison or the criminal legal system. The resources that have led to my success were primarily through my outreach to teachers to get back into school and a connection to a sponsor at home, and the exposure to opportunities and careers I never once thought that I could become or fulfill. I got in contact with professors that ingrained in me my potential to succeed and do something productive with myself. I do have to put a lot of emphasis on the ability of education and teachers, incredible messengers, and how they create that sort of empowerment, because coming home after incarceration, I was extremely disconnected and was not really sure what opportunities were left for me. Right, we have a critical opportunity, especially when we're working with young people, to sort of intervene early on in the lives of young people. And we can do this by investing in community-based diversion systems, where we're not removing young people from communities that take them away to locations far from their family and friends, and intentionally direct funding into the issues that young people identify as barriers for them. So instead of guessing what young people are dealing with, it's extremely important to have those conversations with young people and ask them, what is it that you need? If a young person is facing adverse life experiences, you know, it's up to systems to kind of bring them in and work with them to help provide and allow them to see, you know, their ability, because every young person is worth investing in. But so Connecticut, primarily, if I want to, you know, create some time here to just talk about Connecticut, it primarily, historically, has been a leader in youth justice reform. However, recently there's been this idea that, especially when we're talking about car theft, that car theft is on the rise and that youth are out of control, and sort of bringing up what Florentina had mentioned, the super predator myth. And a lot of it has come from just the shift in crimes. There actually historically hasn't been a rise in crime beyond years past, especially when we're talking about youth car theft. And it's not even youth car theft, because the clearance rate, you know, it doesn't even actually identify who's stealing the cars. So, but, you know, through media and whatnot, this has become a politicized issue, and especially is something that politicians this year are writing their electoral campaigns on, these tough on crime approaches. And so right now we're at a pivotal moment, and how we work to address young people who need the helps and supports. And Connecticut right now is exploring opening its juvenile training school for young people, which is a prison. And right now, before that decision is made, it's extremely important that we have these conversations, and what is the best way of dealing with young people who are coming in contact with the system. Detention, removing them from schools, removing them from their family is not the answer. And I don't need to go in about that. We know that incarceration doesn't work. We know that punitive approaches and, you know, a kind of ingraining or exasperating, you know, issues of trauma and isolation are not helpful to young people. And so it's important that we take this opportunity to speak to young people and invest in our communities, invest in our schools, and invest in opportunities for young people.
So much, Brittany, both for sharing your story and for the work that you're doing in Connecticut. I'd love to hand it over to Nate Balis, who has some slides to present of what's been happening at the JDAI sites around the country, and he'll walk us through that now.
Thanks, Josh, and thanks, Brittany and Florentina. It was great listening to both of you, and it's kind of tough to follow, but I'm going to dive into some more data. So I'll start. I'm Nate Balis. I work at the Annie Casey Foundation. I'm the director of our Juvenile Justice Strategy Group. And when I first read the Sentencing Project report, my reaction was essentially what you see on this slide, this title slide here, which was that yes, like always focus on admissions to understand the size and scope of youth incarceration. And for any of us on this call today, our ambition is not less incarceration for those who are locked up, but to keep young people out of detention and incarceration entirely. So yes, admissions matter, and good for the sentencing report for saying so. But in order to hold systems accountable for the number of young people in confinement, we have to be as focused on the back door as we are at the front door to detention. For years, this has been a concern at the Annie Casey Foundation, because as admissions to detention have declined, largely because arrests have declined so much, as Josh is pointing out in this report, the urgency to get kids out of detention has clearly waned. And lengths of stay have been a major source of racial disparities, and that's before the pandemic. And then the pandemic began, and the dangers of detention took on a totally new meaning. Now there was the fear that being sent to detention could be a literal death sentence as the country grappled with COVID-19. For years, we've been collecting statistics from JDI sites on an annual basis. And we had a lot of concerns about that data, including the fact that it suffered from the kind of lag that Josh talked about of the national court data, where it's every couple of years and you're getting it late. And also that the data were grouped into two racial categories, essentially white kids and kids of color, is how we did it. Now, we just decided when we came home at the start of the pandemic that we try to do a monthly survey and see if people responded, and totally voluntary from places. We'd ask about some COVID information, but mainly we want to know about the detention population. We ask how many kids are in detention and how many admissions every single month. And we've been really surprised by how much data we've gotten. Over 2 years into this, we're getting data from jurisdictions in more than 30 states, and it covers about a quarter of the youth population around the country. So I'm rushing a bit here. There's a lot more to say about that, but I know I don't have a lot of time. So I'm going to talk about what happened with the data in a couple ways. But first, let me give you like the highest level headlines. Since right before the pandemic begun, admissions per day to detention are down 31%, and the detention population is down 17%. Now, the reason for that gap, the reason we have the gap is that admissions are down almost twice as much as the population, is that kids are getting out slower than they were before the pandemic. And they're getting out much slower than they were in March 2020, when everyone was panicked about getting kids out of detention because of what was going on. Now, I'm going to show you a couple ways how that's playing out.
Great.
I know that looked funny. Sorry. That was intentional to get everybody excited about what was coming next. So I'm going to show you a couple of different ways how that's playing out. And the first one I want to talk about is by showing, by breaking up the sites that are giving us the data into three groups. And this is based purely on the number of kids in detention. So we label the ones on the left as the best, the ones on the right as the worst, and the ones in the middle as the middle of the sites. And they're broken up based on the number of reports. So if we look and start at admissions, and I'm using admissions rate, and the reasons for that is just to be able to compare sort of apples to apples. We have data from Chicago and Houston, and we have data from like tiny rural counties around the country. So we're trying to do this kind of apples to apples. I think the most interesting thing you'll see here is that the groups labeled best performing and middle kind of look the same. They have different starting points here because there's actually just more kids in the middle, but they basically look exactly the same. The one on the right, you can see that at this point, admissions are almost back to where they were pre-pandemic. So just start that and look at that. But now I'm going to show you what releases look like. Now, releases, now here we might be happy that the admissions are down. The orange line there was the the rate pre-pandemic. Now, and we're happy that they're down. But for release rates, we want release rates to be high. Higher the release rate, faster kids are getting out. And what we see here is if you look on the very left-hand side, you'll see this big spike in release rates. That's March 2020. That's everyone going, oh my goodness, like there's a pandemic and kids are in detention. And just in those last 2 weeks of March, there was this rush to get kids out of detention. And what you see here is that in all these places, it's never really gone back up to that level. But what you see across these sites here is on the left, the best performing sites are basically at their average release rate that they were before the pandemic. The ones in the middle are below that and have stayed below that. And the ones on the right, the worst performing, are way below that. And I put that out there because when you look at them, what happens, well, again, the two groups on the left are the same when it comes to admissions, but their releases are different. And here's what that does to the population. So now look at the population, the number of kids in detention. And what you'll see here is that for the group that's the best performing, their population is still down almost by half pre-pandemic, down like by half pre-pandemic. The ones on the right are up more than 40%. And the ones in the middle are inching up now towards being flat since from when the pandemic started. I know I'm going through a lot here, but I just want to it's more illustrative, not to do the math here, but just to give the point of like these two things play off each other. And when admissions are down, great. But if the release rate's down too, you lose the gains that you have. One way of explaining the group that's doing the worst then is if you think of the fact that admissions are completely flat and the population is up 40+%, that means the entire reason it's up is because kids are getting out slower than they used to get out. The other thing I'll just point out that's kind of amazing with this is these groups, look at the beginning, these weren't actual groups pre-pandemic. They had the exact same release, they had the exact same detention rates pre-pandemic across these three groups. This entire phenomenon happened during the pandemic, the fact that they became different. And I point that out because a lot of you are gonna be hearing here's the reason why our detention population is up. And what I would point out is that these groups look a lot alike when you start looking at all the differences between them. And it gets back to the central point always, which is all of these are decisions. These are decisions that they're making, that the sites are making. And I particularly point out release because the decisions that are made about release are entirely up to the system, whether that's judges, whether it's probation agencies, whether it's prosecutors, it's up to the system. Admissions are driven by a lot of things, including how many arrests there are, but releases are driven by those who get to make decisions in the system. Okay. One other way I want to talk about this stuff is about getting into race, race and ethnicity. I think this is really important to be able to look at these data. So we all know that like pre-pandemic, we have huge disparities in race. We saw it across our detention data and what we were seeing around the country. So what happened during the pandemic? So I'm going to start, and again, I'm going to talk about this by focusing on release rates. But what I will tell you is that overall admissions by race have been pretty similar over time. They've changed a bit now, but basically we've had a similar drop from pre-pandemic levels. Again, huge disparities pre-pandemic, but a similar drop across racial groups. But what I want to show you here is a few different things. The orange line, again, is the pre-pandemic average for white youth in terms of the detention population. The blue line is the detention population now. The gray line is the population if it had matched this racial group's peak of a release rate, meaning in March 2020. So what you see here is for white youth, the population's down a bunch, yes, but the population would be down way more if they had maintained that March 2020 release rate, okay? Now, if I add now, I'm gonna look at Hispanic youth as well. What you'll see is overall, they look a lot like white youth in terms of the population, at least in these sites. And what we'll see is that the overall disparities pre-pandemic, Hispanic youth in these sites were about twice as likely to be in detention as white kids, and it's still just about twice as likely. But that extra line, the yellow one there, is not just what, the gray line is what if for Hispanic youth that the release rate had been its best month, March 2020. The yellow line is what if it had been the white kids' best month? What if it looked like the white kids in March 2020? And what you see is what we actually found is detention for Hispanic kids would be down more than white kids right now since pre-pandemic if their release rate looked like white kids in March 2020. Now look at Black youth. So now you can see for Black youth that the population now is back almost what it was pre-pandemic. And while we have seen an increase in admissions and a gap in admissions rate a bit by race, most of this is being driven by release rate. The difference between Black youth versus Hispanic and white youth is mostly driven by release rate. And if you look again at what would happen if Black youth had maintained their own March 2020 release rate, and then especially what if it looked like white youth in March 2020, you can see that this would be a completely different story. So I have so much more I could say about all of this stuff, and I would love to share more with anybody. There's lots that we can do, but I just wanted to give a sense of counterbalance to just say, like, it all matters. And like holding systems accountable means you can't give an inch, not just on the front door, but the back door as well. And these data have been really illuminating for us in terms of understanding that.
Thank you all. You know, I've been looking at the chat box and seeing the questions come in. I'm going to do my best to get to the questions as we go, but you know, you have our contact information if we don't get to them. The place that I want to start though, because Brittany was talking about this in Connecticut with car theft, and Florentina was talking about it, what a difficult atmosphere this is. And I want to know what it's like doing advocacy in state legislatures right now under this atmosphere of increased fear about crime. You know, do you find that this is a time to back off? Do you find that maybe we've been pushing too hard? Like, what do you say to that that legislator who says, not now? Brittany, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. And we definitely encountered that this year. And however, now, I mean, it's the most critical opportunity, the most critical time to continue to push. It now is the opportunity to, one, that we have the data that sort of depicts the story of what's going on. We were having a decrease in crime rates. You see a peak during COVID, but it's still not way past where we were at. However, what's caused like the biggest shift in the political atmosphere has been the location of crimes. The crimes were like historically back up until around 2017 or so were taking place in cities. And then you start to see in the data a drop in car theft in the cities, and though the car theft has shifted geographically into the suburbs. So of more predominantly white communities, right? And so now there's this outrage. There's this outrage that crime is out of control, when actually it's not too far past where we were at in 2019, which was at its lowest rates. So what we do need to continue to push is the data. And we do need to continue to remind legislators that this has been an issue that has historically plagued underserved communities, low-income communities or communities, but predominantly, Black or Latinx populations. And we weren't really focusing on the issues then. And then we also need to identify the best ways and use our funding now. If we are going to, bring up the topic of youth justice, we do need to focus on, okay, so then what is the best way? We all know that, majority, 99% or 100% of the youth that are going into our systems will be coming home. So do we create it harder for them to reintegrate into communities? Do we detain them, or how can we make their lives better, and intervene in the best way, especially when we're talking about financially, sponsoring and funding activities in the youth justice reform. If this is the topic, then let's talk about the best way to do it, because we've known for years now that the way we've been funding and addressing young people and youth involved in the justice system has not worked. So then let's talk about solutions that work. So now is the time to press, I think.
I'd like to change the question a little bit to ask Florentina, because I think that your organization does such a good job of seeing a whole child, of not seeing that a child is the worst thing that he or she has ever done, but the need to invest in effective programs. And so can you talk about, in meeting with legislators, about the idea of what an expensive and ineffective program it is, and how well that gets through to legislators? Like, what are your effective messages that you think our listeners could be able to use when they're talking to their own legislators?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, ineffectiveness is definitely one of the messages. I think one of the things that we continue to sort of focus on in any messaging is that not only is this an ineffective system, it's an abusive and violent system. And thirdly, that it's a racist system. Here in Louisiana, Black youth are 6 times as likely to be incarcerated as white youth. And so, I do think that, as Brittany's saying, in sort of a crisis moment where there are fears that are high, I think that also presents an opportunity in terms of getting to the real solutions and really breaking down sort of the narrative where people are actually willing to listen right now because of those fears and are looking for solutions. So I think that, when we message, certainly trying to get them to look at the front end solutions and kind of, recognize the system for what it is in terms of that abusiveness, ineffectiveness, and racism is an important part of that. And, that's going to depend on, who the legislator is in terms of which 3 of those things will appeal the most. And so we certainly, try to paint the full picture, but be smart as well about, who we're speaking to and what we're saying to them. But we have seen, I think, like I said, I think in this moment of increased fears, I think that there's more willingness to actually look for the solutions versus just react and do the next thing. So I am feeling a little bit positive and optimistic about that, even though it can seem bleak.
One of the, it wasn't exactly but a comment in the chat was people saying this is depressing, and it is, don't get me wrong, but I think that what we've seen is that there are messages that break through. There have been successes, there are alternative programs. And so when I see a question from someone in Kentucky saying that there's a bill moving to mandate holds after certain kinds of arrests, or in Connecticut, that they are expanding the amount of time that a child can be held before being seen for a judge. Nate, you could jump in here and talk about some of the detention alternatives and what you'd say to the legislators who are saying our solution is to mandate a hold instead of looking at an individual child case by case.
What would I say? I'd say that it's foolish, and we've known forever that it's foolish. But I'm not a great lobbyist or policy person. But I think from a purely messaging standpoint, from what we experience, is that detention is overused in every place in the country, and it's overused precisely because of not looking at kids as individuals and not going back to that point of what's the purpose of this at all. And that, I think, following the chat and why I wanted to talk about this, about that point of length of stay, is because I do think this aspect of complete lack of urgency, of that once a youth is put in detention, feeling like it's okay for them to sit there. I do think people need to understand, yes, the dangers of detention and why it's not okay. But I also think needing to understand that there are so many other things that they could be doing at the same time. My guess, and this is the biggest thing I just want, and this is less a message for a legislator, but I think an important thing to pressure the systems on, which is that in March 2020, the reason why I focus on that data about the releases is because what that said to me, and I think one of the reasons why I was so glad we ended up getting these data, is that it's possible. So like, if 2/3 of the kids could get out of detention in a month because there was urgency, then there can always be that ability to do it. It's not like it's impossible to happen. There's nothing magical that made those kids all of a sudden able to be released and they weren't the month before. Same way, if we're looking at data, I went through it so fast, look at the data every year and see how many kids are detained on January 1st as opposed to December 1st. It's always lower. Why? Because of Christmas and the holidays. The detention numbers go down. Is something magical changing about what the kids are doing? No. It's all about the decisions that we're making to put fewer kids in and get them out faster. So I guess the point to say is like, there are hard things here. There are hard things to deal with individual cases and for individual young people of challenges of what would let everyone feel that they could be safe at home. But I don't think that the issue is that these sites don't know, places around the country don't know what they can do. They do have detention alternatives in most cases, obviously very different from place to place. Question is, how are they using them? Who are they using them for? And they're really using them on young people who otherwise might be locked up, or are they using them for kids who don't need a detention alternative and could just be at home awaiting their trial or be diverted altogether?
Thank you so much. You know, I feel the same hope when I look at these numbers, that we do see examples, because the data show it, that we don't have to lock up that many kids. And I love your example of December 31st versus January 1st, that these decisions are not based in danger to the community, danger to themselves, but about choices that people are making. And if people are making those choices, then we as constituents, as voters, can make them make different choices. You know, that's what inspires me to do this work. I'm curious, and I'd be happy to have any of you answer this question, but we're getting questions, versions of how can I do this work in my community? I think that people who are in Louisiana and Connecticut know good organizations to get in contact with now. But when they were to reach out to you, you know, let's say that you're getting an email, what would you do to put someone to work? How can people get involved in their communities? Because we do know that there's organizations like yours, exceptional grassroots organizations around the country. The National Juvenile Justice Network is a great place to find them, njjn.org. But talk about how you put regular people, good-hearted people to work, making change happen. And I'd be happy to have Brittany or Florentina answer that.
I'll start, and I think I'll be sort of brief in my approach here to save some time, but I think the most important thing is engaging communities, engaging families, and engaging young people, because they provide that, you know, they are the closest to the problem and they are closest to the solution. I think having conversations in communities and creating an awareness, educating people like that issues are present, that things are being brought up in the state legislature. I know prior to my work with the Alliance, I had no idea what was going on in laws and things that were going to affect myself or young people, things of that sort. So I think as we start to engage and you know, bring in families, young people, and communities, you know, we start to create movement, and we start to create, you know, outreach to legislators, and we start to, you know, create our own agenda and narrative on issues and how they should be solved.
Yeah, and I'll say similarly that Flick is sort of like a model of how one could get involved, because, you know, that is who we are. You know, we're families and friends of Louisa's incarcerated children. And so, you know, what we seek to do is to really help support those who are impacted and lift up their voices and have them lead the charge. But anybody can sort of come into that circle and help that support. And that looks a lot of different ways, depending on who we're supporting. You know, we've had, you know, since I'm working in communications, a lot of times that's uplifting the voices of people who have been impacted. Making sure that they're sort of directing what they want to do and how they want to do it, and providing that support. So I would say, yeah, getting involved with those who are already leading these efforts. And, you know, there's a long legacy, I think, in every state of people leading this effort and figuring out what those who are most impacted want to do. And I would say that even sort of if you're not directly impacted, there's definitely a role for you in leading that support. And you just have to find out what that is and look at your own skills as well. Again, my skill was communications work. And so figuring out who I was connected to, you know, in terms of the media, to be able to lift up people's stories when they found that that was serving them and helpful to build in a sense of empowerment. And the other thing I would mention is, just because we are focused on systems change, when we're looking at you know, making a difference, we're definitely looking at how are we sort of looking at breaking points or leverage points within these systems to really push on, and bringing our families and impacted people into those leverage points to push on them. So yes, as somebody mentioned in the chat box, you know, we need a solutions-based approach. We need to be looking at the front end and continuing to redirect the conversation from policing, prisons, to mental health supports, coordinated systems of care, education, addressing poverty. And we need to continue to redirect that conversation to how we're supporting those community-based interventions.
Well, thank you so much. You know, and thank you. We had, you know, about 150 people were here today. This has all been recorded. We're eager to hear from you. Just don't hesitate to get in contact with the Sentencing Project. You can find me at Rovner at Sentencing Project. We are all, you know, on Twitter and Facebook and all those other places to keep this conversation going. There is so much work to be done and so many good people doing it. You met some of them today, but I assure you there are great people in your states too who are doing this too. And I just want everyone to know that you are not in these fights alone. The Sentencing Project is ready to help and make a difference where you live if you'll have us. So thank you very much. Thank you, Nate, Florentina, Brittany, and we will continue the conversation. Thank you all.